controversial and incomparable nonfiction author who is currently toiling the death bell for fiction and arguing that all literature must be fragmented. In his most recent work published this month, How Literature Saved My Life, Shields quotes David Foster Wallace's, whose birthday is actually today. His claim that, quote, the very best works construct a bridge across that abyss of human loneliness. And then Shields briefly celebrates 52 works ranging from writers such as St. Augustine, Richard Brautigan, John Cheever, Annie Dillard, Philip Larkin, Marcel Proust, and Kurt Vonnegut. Bernard Cooper's Maps to Anywhere is among that 52. On April 25th, our very own, for this year we are so lucky, Stephanie Alessandro Greist, this year's Vibrance writer, will be closing this year's series with As Only She Can, Gusto. So we hope to see you at all of those readings. And now to introduce Bernard Cooper. One night in the spring of 2005, I rushed into the Student Center at Southern Utah University, past a table of blue books, Maps to Anywhere, and into a room where I took a seat in the front row. Moments later, Bernard Cooper sat down at a table and pulled out sheets of white paper with words on them and started into the fine art of sighing from his second memoir, a collection of essays, Truth Serum. At any given moment, he read, there must be thousands of people sighing. As Cooper continued, I sat in my chair in a black dress, I remember, self-conscious that I had put on too much of the blush I had bought only the day before, and began a long and ponderous sigh that has carried me through every book, every page, every line of Bernard Cooper's writing. The next semester, I taught Truth Serum in my advanced nonfiction class, and since then, I've never taught nonfiction, nor will I ever again, without one of Bernard Cooper's essays or books on the syllabus. A year after that reading, I asked Cooper to contribute to an anthology I was editing, which was to examine the overlap between fiction and nonfiction. I hoped he'd send 101 Ways to Cook Hamburger, one of the essays he read that night in Utah. In his commentary that follows that essay in the anthology, he writes, I tend to think of creative nonfiction in the broadest possible terms, a text that can accommodate the objectivity of reportage, the characterizations and taught dialogue of fiction, and the distilled imagery and imaginative leaps of poetry. 2006 saw the publication of Cooper's memoir, The Bill from My Father. The New York Times Book Review began, at their most astute, memoirs are about more than the story of someone's life. They are about the function of memory itself, its narrative power to create and destroy, sweeten and obliterate the past in the service of the present. The Bill from My Father is just such a memoir. When I began another anthology project in 2010, this one on the writing about writing, or writing that is self-conscious or self-reflective, meta-writings, I once again contacted Bernard and asked for Winner Take Nothing, one of the essays from the bill. Again, he graciously obliged. This time I interviewed him. His answer to my question about why he writes, I write to say what I haven't yet been able to articulate, and to use language to give a name to amorphous emotions and states of mind. Words contain and give a provisional shape to what is otherwise nameless and unexpressed. One of the pleasures to be had in writing from memory is the chance to go back in time and give voice to what was vague and overwhelming. And to laugh, too, as Cooper combines absurdity with elegy, ever punctuating his meditations with humor. In another question, I mentioned the writers he alludes to in the bill from my father: Elizabeth Bishop, Sylvia Plath, James Merrill, Ernest Hemingway, James Baldwin, and John Cheever. When I read the book, I couldn't help thinking that writers view the world through the lens of writing. Their own, for sure, but many times through the work of others. He responded, "Not only have those authors written books that have been life-changing for me, they have written single lines that have served as touchstones as I try to make sense of life's often nameless sensations. Truth Serum is one of the life-changing books for me, and a single line that I go back to again and again, one of many I've underlined with my blue pen. You ache for a way to make sense of your nature. You dive headlong into the well of yourself." Sometimes I open the book and reread that line for assurance. Other times I use it to ask myself in my own writing how to make sense of my nature. But back to the single lines that resonate with Cooper. One from James Merrill's poem, The Mad Scene. "Again last night I dreamed the dream called laundry. A few weeks ago, in my seminar devoted to the writings of Truman Capote and Bernard Cooper, I printed out the poem for my students, and when I got home, I put my copy up on my refrigerator. Now, at least once a day, I roll over the line aloud, I dreamed the dream," which is what writers do when we go back to the past. We dream the dream of the places, of the people, of the versions of ourselves that we once were or weren't. As Cooper describes it, writing is not a way to understand, but to delve into the riddle, to inhabit. Through language, we can dream that dream. In the bill from my father, Cooper builds an essay around Elizabeth Bishop's One Art and ponders its title. I began to wonder whether cumulative loss defies the laws of simple addition, its effect exponential. Could this be the one art of the poem's title? One, because loss is ongoing. Art, because one must make and make again a life despite who and what is missing. In his question and in his writing, Cooper navigates loss in a way that allows us all to continue to live through our own. As for his own life, Cooper once said in an interview, "I don't think I have a rich life. I think I have an ordinary life. What I have is a very specific way of looking at things that I have cultivated through writing." Christopher Isherwood said that even a mouse that has spent his entire life in a wall could write an incredible novel. It wasn't the breadth, the depth of experience that could make the writing, but a unique take on the world that can make even ordinary things seem exceptional. Bernard Cooper is also a fiction writer, a novel, A Year of Rhymes, and a collection of short stories, Guess Again. His prose has appeared in Story, Plowshares, Harper's, the Paris Review, the New York Times Magazine, and has been included in 5 volumes of the Best American Essays. He has won the PEN Ernest Hemingway Award, an O. Henry Prize, a Guggenheim, and a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. He is currently a core faculty member in the MFA program at Bennington College. It is my honor to offer you the fine art, the one art of Bernard Cooper.
Done and what you've worked hard for and what you've cared about and doubted. And it reminds me of this incredible thing about art, which is that you, and writing especially, which is that you can speak to someone from very far away, across time, across distance. And Jill and I have encountered each other several times. We don't know each other very well, but in some way we do. And that's one of the great things about being a writer and knowing other writers. So, and other incredible teachers, I might add. Anyway, can you all hear me okay? I'm gonna, yeah. Oh, that's my arm, by the way. How's that? Is that a little better? Or? Okay. All right, so I'm going to start, first of all, by thanking Jill for bringing me here. And although some of you I know in Jill's class have read the bill from my father, I wasn't sure how many people had. And so I thought I would begin by reading what is perhaps the kind of core essay in the book, the book that explains the title. And this is just a section from the book. But it explains about the bill and how the title originated. When I was 28 years old, my father sent me a bill for his paternal services. Typed on his law firm's onion skin stationery, the bill itemized the money he'd spent on me over my lifetime. Since he hadn't kept tabs on the exact amounts he doled out over the years, expenditures were rounded off to the nearest dollar and labeled food, clothing, tuition, and incidentals. Beneath the tally, in the firm but detached language common to his profession, he demanded that I pay him back. The total was somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 million. I remember being impressed by the amount, though this may have been a defense that allowed me to feel more worthy than worthless. What an expensive life I'd lived. I was shocked and insulted too, of course, not only because my father had made such a calculation, but because my life could be added up or reduced to a single figure. To see your existence in the form of a bill gives all your loves and fears and struggles about as much poignancy as a check for a cup of coffee. The millions of dollars I supposedly owed my father didn't strike me as a specific sum, so much as an abstract, unpayable enormity, especially given the amount then in my checking account. The salary I earned as an adjunct teacher was nothing compared to this Everest of debt. No bar chart or pie graph or table of weights and measures could have better illustrated the fact that I earned a pittance. In short, the bill was having the effect my father had probably intended. I can't for the life of me remember what had prompted my father to send me this bill in the first place. And as long as I can't remember, I risk sounding as though I'm leaving out some blunder or ingratitude on my part, for which this bill was retribution. A discerning reader might understandably wonder if I'm choosing to make myself appear more innocent and put upon than I actually was. But can't it sometimes take one to tango? Don't undeserved blows come out of the blue? The truth, as best I can recount it, has me going about a routine Saturday when a letter fell through the mail slot, one among others. It surprised me to see my father's return address. Our occasional contact tended to take place on the phone or in person. I noted that the salutation, Bernard, wasn't preceded by dear, but this formality seemed fitting for an official document. There came a point during the literal and metaphorical unfoldings of the letter when I thought simply, oh, an invoice. Perhaps my father was sending it along to me for reasons the text would make clear. And so I read on. Your obligations to your father, the party of the first part, are considerable, and the only way to make his sacrifices evident in the form of the following, recorded herein as a legal and binding document. Should you fail to make payment in full, this matter will result in actions for which I advise you to hire counsel. That my father, swept up in lawyerly omniscience, referred to himself in third person only added to my confusion. Not to mention the detached sensation that I was gazing upon the letter and myself slumped in a chair as I read it from a stratospheric height. When I finally grasped what had happened, I'd been billed for my upbringing. I let the letter drop into my lap. I double-checked the signature. It was his, all right. The letters rich with loops and convolutions. Go ahead, I thought. Let him charge me. See if I pay. No parent in his right mind asks his child to reimburse him for that child's life. I didn't ask to be born, I thought melodramatically. Besides, had I known I'd be charged for my boyhood, I might have eaten fewer snacks, been easier on my shoes, or more frugal with my allowance. Suppose I actually would need to hire a lawyer to fight this in court. The first candidate who sprang to mind was none other than my father. In other words, as I sat in my sunny living room, utterly stunned, my image of him would not shift from dad as lawyer to litigant as dad. I couldn't help but dream up a doozy of a counterclaim, its itemizations even more preposterous than my father's. Chronic insecurity, $90,000. Narcissistic wound, $75,000. Edible complex, $15,000. I thought that was pretty fair, not much, but of course, because these damages were psychological in nature, it was both difficult and whimsical to assign them a monetary value. But the punitive spirit of this counterclaim was gratifying, for a while at least. Then the whole petty endeavor depressed me, and I thought, is this what people are to each other? A flurry of demands that can't be met? Hurts for which there's no restitution? By ignoring my father's letter, I risked his vengeance, and though I seriously doubted that he'd have the audacity to take me to court, the letter proved him capable of who knew what. To answer back, to acknowledge his claim in any way was to give it credence. Still, I couldn't help but wonder if his demand did have credence, especially if I thought of the debt as familial rather than monetary. He was my father, after all, the man who bore my fiscal burdens, and every son owes his father something. So that explains kind of what's at the heart of the memoir. And we were talking a lot in Joel's class today about the nature of ideas, what happens in the process of editing, in the very long, difficult process, I think, of writing a book. And I remember so distinctly how one night at a dinner party, a bunch of my friends were sitting around. We were all telling our kind of war stories about our parents, which were pretty funny. And I remembered telling this, and suddenly it struck me as the most incredible thing. And I felt two things simultaneously. One is that it was really funny, that it was so eccentric, it was almost slightly mad. And on the other hand, 40 years later, I was still really hurt that he did that. And there's a way in which I think material that combines a kind of fascination and bewilderment for the writer, which causes you to think about something kind of initially puzzling, is often really good material to write about. And the process of discovering how you felt, the ways in which you were conflicted, the nuances of feeling, and especially what drove another person to do something that you did not understand, is often a huge motivating force in the creation of a book, which hopefully is a way of a writer asking and, to some extent, answering their own question. One of the things that's always been in all genres of writing, and in fact other arts as well, but I read poetry. It's the first thing I do when I get the New Yorker. There's a form called prose poetry, which I love, which was primarily a kind of French invention. Paul Baudelaire. There were a lot of writers who were trying to get a kind of poetic density, but in the form of prose. And I still write things that are kind of like short stories, sort of like essays, kind of like poems. And with that very ambiguous description, let me read one of them. Two things came together in the writing of this. One is, for 6 years, I was actually the art critic, I can still barely believe this, of Los Angeles Magazine. And I had studied art, but the editor asked me to write specifically because I didn't have an academic background. I was not an academic, I was not an art historian. I was an essayist, and I loved talking about and thinking about the visual arts. And I think that that's what he responded to in my work. Combined with this is the fact that I am a lifelong insomniac. It's a miracle when I sleep through the night, even with Ambien, my drug of choice. And one night I was, 3 o'clock in the morning, I was reading a lot of artists' manifestos. For those of you who have not read artists' manifestos, they're kind of amazing documents of individuals or collective movements that try to express what they're doing in the arts. And in the early 1900s in Italy, there was a group of artists who became incredibly influential who called themselves the Futurists. And they believed that museums should be destroyed, that machines were the most beautiful things in the world, that all traditional forms of beauty and meaning and value had to be overturned. I mean, it was kind of like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But the Futurist Manifesto, which was written in 1909, is this kind of hyper wild thing with lots of exclamation points and calling for, basically the end to civilization as we know it. And it was really disturbing to read at 3 o'clock in the morning. So I decided I was going to write the Insomniac Manifesto as if it was an art movement. So here's the Insomniac Manifesto. Sleep is the opiate of the masses, a retreat from the teeth-grinding and ceaseless thinking that is our true calling as humans. What use is a body sprawled on cotton, as still as a statue? We who toss and turn each night, we sentries fretting in the moonlight say, deep breathers everywhere, awake. Rise from your beds, free yourself from the stranglehold of blankets, shed your flimsy bedclothes and don a scratchy woolen suit, chafing shoes and belts and watch bands, the glorious clothes of consciousness. Dreams are nothing more than deception. You hold the winning lottery ticket. The dead one returns to your arms at last. The exam is passed with flying colors. The speech delivered, even though you are nude. O dozers and catnappers and citizens of Nod, you must turn your backs on the illusory satisfactions of the dream life. Surrender yourself to churning worry, to indecision, to doubts as bright and numberless as stars. Warm milk, bounding sheep, a fresh prescription for Ambien. Where have they gotten you? Half your life squandered, time that would have been better spent regretting the past and dreading the future. Think of it, if you're not too groggy. You might have constructed grain by monotonous, painstaking grain, a mountain out of a molehill. You say you need your 40 winks? Go ahead and make excuses, each as thin as a well-worn sheet. A life where pale dawns are lost is no life at all. We, the bleary-eyed, the perpetually restless, the not for a moment seduced by sleep, we tell you there's light in pots of black coffee, high adventure while pacing the floor. While others slumber, insensible, we urge you to make yourself irate by recalling old slights. to see the unstoppable progress of time by studying your face in the bathroom mirror. Everyone over 30 found that very funny. To embrace the terrors of kidnap, plane crash, and coronary by watching late-night TV. You must make your palates from brittle straw. You must fling your limbs at uncomfortable angles, each less conducive to sleep than the next. You must picture the mites, mandibles and all, who inhabit your mattress. You know, there are little tiny microscopic things you don't ever want to see through an electron microscope inside your mattress. Listen, rousing new tunes have replaced the quaint music of crickets, the mumbling of doves on a window ledge, the rain's drowsy, insistent whisper. Gunshots, sirens, car alarms, raging dogs, squalling babies, couples fucking like wildebeests. Why disregard this wealth of noise for a meager lease on oblivion? What you hear is an anthem throbbing through the walls. Stand up, comrades. Look alive. We must reconsider the meaning of sleep. We must think again and again and again. Something that I've been struggling to write about for a long time, and I actually, my next book is a book about visual art, and I'm gonna, or at least my interest in it, my education in it, and I'm gonna read from that last. But I also have a manuscript that is almost 3/4 of the way finished that I haven't had the kind of emotional wherewithal to finish. Probably about 3 months after my last book, The Bill from My Father, came out, my partner of 24 years died, and it was, you know, it's like being through a plane crash or something to have someone you've been with that long, you know, die and be with them. It's an incredible thing. A writer, an amazing writer, a nonfiction writer named Sally Tisdale, who's also a Buddhist and who was very sweet to both of us during this whole thing, said that being with somebody when they die is a gift. Unfortunately, it's not such a great gift for the person who lives beyond it, because you kind of have to live with the memory and the weight and the sort of, you know, dealing with the grief of it. And even Brian himself, in this sort of incredible moment, said to me, when he was, you know, pretty close to dying, he said, you know, I think it must be harder for the person who has to watch. Which was such an incredible thing for him to say, because, I mean, he had so many reasons to be afraid and sad, but it's funny, his strength really helped me get through his death, which is a kind of terrible irony. So I tried to write about this last very difficult year. Brian and I found out very soon after we became a couple. The AIDS test had just become available, and we found out that we were called what is known as a serodifferent couple. So we both got tested back in the day where you had to go down and wait for your test results, and it turned out that he was positive and I was negative. And, you know, it actually brought us much closer together, and we had an incredible life together. Here's a little something. It was actually an excerpt from something longer that I'm very lucky to have had in the New York Times. So here it goes. After Brian has brushed his teeth, after he's swallowed a fistful of pills, after he's injected Neupogen into the fraction of fat he can pinch from his belly, he dons a pair of pajamas and says, I'm ready to get plugged in. He means he's ready for me to connect him to the FlowGuard, a small computerized machine that's clamped to an IV pole beside our bed. Every night for 8 hours, a rich synthetic liquid called paranutrition is infused into his bloodstream, fattening every cell. Or so we keep hoping. Infusions are the last treatment left to slow his rapid weight loss from AIDS. When I press start, milky droplets are pumped through a drip chamber, then along a PICC line, and finally through the shunt in Brian's arm. He lies back on a stack of pillows and closes his eyes. Neupogen stimulates the growth of white blood cells and make his bones sensate in a way he never thought possible. He can feel the marrow aching within them. Painkillers don't ease the discomfort so much as they drug him into a foggy resignation that passes for repose. Still, he feels lucky that, quote, the whole rigmarole, unquote, as he calls it, doesn't keep him from a good night's sleep. Tonight he's out by 8 o'clock and I slip into the bed beside him. But the deeper Brian sinks towards sleep, his hands unclenching, his jaw going lax, the more wary I become. During my waking hours, I think of myself as a reasonably protective person, but at night this instinct is magnified, even if he's breathing peacefully beside me. My hairs bristle and muscles tense at the slightest vibration. I could spring across the room if I had to. I could lift the bed and carry him to safety. I'm at the ready, though I don't know for what. As I lay in bed and listen, sounds reach me with piercing clarity and in nearly tangible shapes and patterns. Hip-hop throbs from a driver's moonroof, its trail of rubbery bass notes bouncing off the asphalt. A helicopter passes overhead and rips the sky into tattered black rags. The infusion pump isn't loud exactly, but in the process of generating each precisely measured drip, it repeatedly makes what the layperson would hear as a single sound, whereas the exhausted aficionado hears a bedeviling sequence of sounds. It begins with a metallic tick. Next comes a deepening hum as a single ivory bead expands at the top of the drip chamber, growing too heavy to support its own weight. And just before it falls, the pumping cycle starts all over again, its noise masking the inevitable plink or plop, or whatever would best describe the impact. Being able to see but not hear it suggests that there are other sounds I'm unable to hear, a lapse that makes me all the more wary, which in turn makes me more attuned to sound. I've lost track of the number of nights I've laid there and made a pact with myself to ignore that damn drip, only to go right on thinking about it to the exclusion of everything else. I can't be the only person on earth who'd get a little fixated on a dripping bag of milky liquid suspended in the air beside his bed. The droplets might as well be falling on my forehead. Both thinking about them and trying not to think about them are a form of Chinese water torture. Every drop feeds and hydrates Brian. Every drop perpetuates a world in which he's alive and sleeping beside me. Every drop is deep enough to drown him. I used to read till I fell asleep, but the sound of the pump distracts me from language, goads me again and again into the present. Its churning disrupts the very air, reminds me that it's late in every sense, proves that the world rattles on without us. When I can't stand listening a moment longer, I get out of bed and watch television in the next room. And just as I settle back and relax, just as vigilance loosens its grip, I notice that the sound coming from the TV is more vibrant and lifelike than ever before. How can I be expected to follow, say, the grisly recreation of an unsolved murder, or close-ups of the latest plastic surgery procedure, when I'm busy pivoting my head at different angles to determine whether the TV's enhanced audio is due to the room's acoustics, the set itself, or my own ears? Insomnia, it seems, is spending the night. A couple of my friends wouldn't mind a phone call, even at this hour, but I don't want to wake them. Their kindness is a fund I can draw from when I'll need it most, when after happens. And so I find myself guarding not only Brian's sleep, but my friend's sleep as well. This is an illusory duty, I know, but it lends purpose to long and sleepless hours. I turn off the TV and head back to bed. Late at night, unable to concentrate on books or television, cut off from conversation, it's impossible to escape the vice of life as I know it and lose myself in another story. The only story I know is the one about Brian dying. Our 20-year history has a beginning and a middle, of course, but they've been eclipsed by the sights and sounds of these numbered days. The past is an unimaginable condition in which we possessed a future. It's as if we'd met so we could be together when he dies, paid the mortgage so we could be together when he dies, sustained ourselves with food and love and hard work so we'd one day come to the realization that everything up to this point was a prologue. The story has started here, now, when time is finite. Anyway, I, again, am close to finishing. There's so much kind of reimagining of something that was so difficult to go through in the beginning. And I am in some way determined to do it because I do, one of the things that was very strange about living with somebody who became so physically frail, somebody who'd been, so kind of vital at one point, is that we kind of live in a world where the reality and death and dying, except in this kind of sensationalized way of CSI and blockbuster movies, is sort of swept under the carpet. And I really think that there are just a few great, amazing human experiences that one can write about. Love, and loss, including loss from death. So someday I will finish that book. In the meantime, as a kind of course segue, this is not only about studying visual art, but it's about losing my virginity, which I really sort of debated writing about, but it's not too explicit. When from a very early age, I was completely obsessed with avant-garde art, especially pop art, which was outrageous at the time. And it made me so deliriously happy. And I remember my parents thinking that there was something wrong with me because, I was showing them pictures of soup cans and, this sort of stuff. Isn't this incredible? And I ended up studying avant-garde art. In fact, I went to a school called CalArts, which was started by Walt Disney. And it was at the time supposed to be one of the most kind of technologically sophisticated art schools in the country. And Walt Disney had started the school wanting the school to really be a kind of farm for animators. He thought, I'll start the school, people will come out of this program and they'll work for Disney. And what happened is that after he died, his brother took over, and for some reason, it became one of the most experimental schools in the United States. So the sort of thing, the classes I went to, the things that happened, I mean, they're both absurd and really fun to recollect. Before that, I went to the School of Visual Arts in Manhattan, and I had not really come out yet. But there was, this book is modeled after this incredible memoir called When Kafka Was the Rage by a writer named Anatole Broyard, who had come back from fighting in the Second World War and was able to go to the New School for Social Research in New York, where all the sort of foremost abstract expressionists were teaching, theorists, and he'd lived a very conventional life and fell in love with this kind of wild bohemian woman and wrote an amazing book where the spirit of experimental art and the sort of discovery of the life force, both in the arts and in eroticism were sort of married in this book. And I wanted to do something sort of the same, but with a very different experience. So here we go. It's from a book coming out, which is tentatively titled My Avant-Garde Education. If there were opportunities to meet and have sex with other men once I'd moved to Manhattan, attention to matters of daily survival and plain fear prevented me from noticing. However, men whom I'd quickly passed on my walk to school would reappear in my fantasies at night. Without even thinking, I'd hoarded erotic provocations, physical details I could conjure at will, a pair of imposing shoulders and a tank top, the arch of a window shopper's back. And yet I hadn't entirely given up on the idea that a female might come along whose compelling beauty or artistic vision could postpone or even change what I'd come to suspect was inevitable. I don't believe it's an oversimplification to say that during the freshman semester, my infatuation with art and my paralysis regarding sex existed in inverse proportion. My response to art was quick, metabolic, and revelatory, while my responses to sex was a muddle of delayed reactions and missed libidinal signals. I was so inhibited, in fact, that losing my virginity might have taken even longer if I hadn't been visited by Allison Howard, who'd been my high school's self-proclaimed nymphomaniac. Tall and blonde and perpetually tan, Allison's goal was to taste mankind in all his shapes and flavors. She'd had almost every eligible boy in our 12th grade class, and I worried that my peers were beginning to wonder why I wasn't among her conquests. One side effect of high school graduation was finally being free of the pressure to bed her. Then she simply showed up during one of her visits to New York, knocking on my apartment door and proposing we go out for an Indian dinner. The restaurant reeked of sandalwood incense. Ragas whirled and eddied in the air. Instead of sitting across from me, Allison swept into the same side of the booth, prodding me along the seat with her hip. "Don't you like to face the other person?" I asked. "I'd rather feel them while I eat," she said. When we talked, I had to twist my neck at an uncomfortable angle and stare into her eyes, intrusively blue. Kissing was as much accident as effort, since our lips were practically touching anyway. If I leaned to one side to get a little air, she'd lean too, maintaining the intimate inch between us, her warm breath bathing my face. Soon, the mechanics of fornication began to seem like less of a physical challenge than our seating arrangement. This suited my date just fine. Allison acted as though our having sex that night was a foregone conclusion. She nibbled my ear, radiant with the assurance that she could not only second guess, but grant my every erotic wish. By the time the waiter arrived, the opportunity of a lifetime had literally thrown itself into my lap, and the easiest thing to do was give in. When I confessed that I'd never had Indian food, Allison... What are you thinking? Allison grabbed the menu out of my hand to order for us, for guiding me inside her, for being too hell-bent on her own pleasure to notice I was a novice in bed. She's the one who did the fucking. I could feel the slippery muscles inside her, firm as a handshake, and perhaps for her as routine a greeting. If my kisses grew too eager, she'd roll on top and wrest control, shoving my limbs where she wanted them. In the aftermath of lovemaking, Allison wiped herself and tossed me the washcloth. I felt manly when I caught it, and thought of all the catches I'd fumble on a field. She reached high into the sleeves of her sweater, letting it shimmy down around her. The formalities of brushing her hair and reapplying her lipstick were executed with a haste that might have been insulting had she not been so graceful. A woman practiced at fleeing the scene. "This apartment's so bare," she told me, standing at the door and looking around, "like no one lives here." She insisted on walking herself to the subway and raised her hand to stop me when I made a move to rise. After she shut the door behind her, I sprawled on the bed, spent from erotic accomplishment, a man who belonged in the world at last. It took only moments to fall asleep, and at some point during the night, I found myself laying on a desolate stretch of highway instead of in my bed. An air horn blared in the distance as faintly and sweetly as a lone bird. And the next thing I knew, I was crushed beneath a truck. I awoke bolt upright, distraught not only because I'd been mashed to a pulp, but because of the fact that I'd lost my virginity and then dreamed I'd been run over. What ridiculously overt symbolism on the part of my subconscious. Did the truck represent Allison? The highway my fate? Did I think of my virginity as roadkill, for God's sake? The next morning, as I walked to school, the men I saw were just as tempting as they had been the day before. So that's the reading. I mean, the writer Annie Dillard said this incredible thing, and it was not having to do with age or you know, when it's right to write memoir, but in regard to essay writing, she said that she told her students, don't wait for anything, because you know there's only a certain window in which you maybe can do something, and if you try it and it doesn't work, you can put it aside and try it again. But there's no reason to sort of say, I'd really like to write about that, but maybe in 5 years I'll settle in, because it probably won't happen. So, you know, there's so many negotiations in the process of writing that, I mean, apart from the craft, when can you do something? And you have to sort of determine that as you go along. And I don't know if there are rules. I think you just have to ask yourself questions and try to do it. And if it doesn't work at that point, you know, wait a little bit. So, yeah.
Somewhat related to that, in your process in writing nonfiction, how long is the period between an event actually happening in your life and that feeling, okay, I have to write about this?
Well, it was strange because, you know, for example, the thing with my father, I mean, I remember that many times, but it wasn't until this one night when I saw that it contained all this stuff. And actually when I realized, my God, I maybe I should write about that. And I kept thinking about it and kept thinking, it, you know, wouldn't let go of me in a certain way. And I just, God, I think you have to listen to what you're preoccupied with and what you're haunted by. And I will also say that it, you know, took a while. It took maybe 4 months for me to realize, you know, this idea won't go away. It's something I should pay attention to. And then, and this is kind of embarrassing, but, you know, at a certain point, I realized that the idea seems to choose you rather than the other way around as a subject. And you don't have to begin knowing what it means at all. I mean, that's another thing, I think, especially with nonfiction writing, especially because of the way, not here, and certainly not with these instructors, my God, but, you know, when I was in high school, at least initially, you know, the essay has 3 paragraphs, you know, it was just this kind of horrible formula that had nothing to do with, you know, anything interesting. But I think essayists discover what they're talking about as they write. All writers do, I think. Yeah.
I'm also from Los Angeles, and one of my biggest problems is how do you convey something that's such a random city? Like in your writing, like, because I've always had trouble because there's so much going on. Like when you write about the city, like, how do you make it so it's not like random jumble?
Well, it's very weird because first of all, I think life is kind of a random jumble unless it's me. But anyway, you know, Los Angeles is a very surreal city.
Sometimes it's just like the phantom was actually happening in front of me. Like it's weird.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's a lot in life that is that way, and every city has their sort of strange, you know, surreal environment. I think what you do is you sort of plumb, P-L-U-M-B, your memory. So images that you probably remember about Los Angeles are, I would bet they are the things that make Los Angeles distinct. For example, I remember, I mean, this happens everywhere, but I remember driving on a freeway in Los Angeles, you know, at like 4 o'clock in the morning when I was a, you know, irresponsible teenager, and seeing someone moving a house down the freeway. And, you know, you don't forget something like that when you're like driving behind somebody's house, you know, and the house is sort of floating over the overpass. Or a writer who is kind of famous for finding ways to encapsulate that particular city, although she doesn't live there anymore, is Joan Didion. And she would be, if you haven't read her, my God, but she talks about things like a woman shopping at a Ralph's supermarket in a bikini in the summer with palm trees disappearing into the smog out the window. I mean, where else is that going to happen, you know? She's one of the few writers who's written really successfully about earthquakes and about this thing called earthquake light, which is probably a myth, but that there's a change in, if an earthquake happens during the day, that the light turns a sort of slight amber color or yellow. So she is kind of obsessed with what goes on around her. And I think you just have to trust yourself to know that the things you remember about a place may, in fact, get at something really important about it. And in Los Angeles, what's important is the fact that it's so spread out that you just, there's so many weird things that happen. Films, people filming so that fake cops are on bridges. You just don't know what is going on. But I bet it's all there. I bet it's all in your head, and that you can draw on it. Yeah.
You said that certainly other writers can influence your work, but do you find that either the work of the classic writers or even contemporaries can alter the themes or even your writing style currently as you're working on a piece?
Well, one of the things I hope that every book that I've loved kind of alters my writing in a good way. One of the things that I talk to a lot with my writer friends and also visual artist friends and musicians is that, I think one thing you learn to do to sustain your life in one art form or another is that you kind of learn to have some say in what comes in. So, for example, this is weird and a very oblique answer to your question, but when I'm writing nonfiction, I can't read nonfiction because what'll happen is I'll read it and I'll go, God, this is really good. Why am I bothered? I'll read short stories and I think, well, I could never do those, but I'm not trying, so what difference does it make? Or when I'm writing something long, I like to read. For example, I have tried to read both contemporary and more traditional Southern writers, and Flannery O'Connor is a complete exception to this. I can read her anytime. But, if you're reading something where there's this kind of dialogue, you find that the problem is the next day you're going, hi, y'all.